Information on Hyperboreans from the contact reports.
Contact Report 39.
Well, then I have another question. Can you tell me how many extraterrestrials of a good form had contact with Earth humans since ages ago?
I have already expected this question from you for a long time, which is why I also strove for the necessary data. Your question really was to be foreseen for a long time. Very many extraterrestrial intelligences came to the Earth from the entire expanse of the Milky Way for thousands of years. For several centuries, however, there have only been very few, and only a few of these tried to pursue communications with the Earth humans or even come into closer contact with these. Mainly, the only ones who did so were those who were interested in showing new and better or simply future ways to the human beings of Earth. On the whole, these intelligences were very distant descendants of your indirect ancestors, and only in very rare cases were these different forms of life, but they were still, to a large degree, of a human-like human form. I can say the exact answer to your question, but with the fact that of all the extraterrestrial visitors to the Earth, only 0.57% of those entered into contact with Earth humans. Excluded from these are those who traveled from afar, from the depths of the universe, who became resident on the Earth in ages past, and who entered into the earthly history of humankind.
That is not exactly a lot. But now, I have a question that has already occupied me for a long time, namely regarding a statement of the Christian Bible. There is talk there of an anti-time or something like that. When, then, should this time come?
This is the prophesied anti-time, or the time of the Antichrist, which is falsely laid out in the Christian Bible, in which the Earth human will free himself or herself from the religious delusion and turn back to the truth. This time is connected to the cosmic age of Aquarius, and the anti-time has already begun with the passage of the first half into the second half of the transitional period, namely exactly at 11:20 HR's GMT on the 3rd of February, 1937.
That would be, therefore, the time of catastrophic confusions, of the churches and other religions' mass murders, and of the political and religious wars, of the degeneration of human beings, and otherwise all evils of the last centuries, and the coming time of catastrophes, etc., which were prophesied by the old prophets, and also by Emmanuel?
Sure. It is just that they still have not found their completion, because the most severe events are yet to come. And to be sure, sectarian murders and mass suicides, as well as religious, murderous riots, neo-Nazi terror, and other terror through right-wing and left-wing radical elements and groups. But in the future, natural disasters will also take the upper hand in a degenerate form, and indeed, not in the least by the fault of Earth humanity. Revolutions and wars will also take the upper hand in menacing measures.
Then it can still become quite cheerful. Will the atomic blockheads still chuck their firecrackers on their heads?
That danger should be averted, at least for now, and according to the probability calculations, that should still be able to be excluded at least up into the 3rd millennium. The values are at 99.8%. Therefore, only an erupting madness of a ruling power or the inattentiveness of human beings could trigger a nuclear war.
So this means that for now, there's no reason to fear a nuclear war anymore.
Sure, if you are thinking of an actual world war,
Then humanity can indeed be calmed, at least for the next 2 or 3 decades.
sure, because such a war could really only be attributed to an erupting madness or inattentiveness. The probability calculations show this with the highest values,
On which one can rely.
with complete certainty.
It is reassuring to know that. Maybe now those in different houses will sleep a little more peacefully. Another question, however, was recently brought to me, with which I cannot do much with. Wait, yes, I have written it here on this slip of paper. What's with Mount Shasta? This is a mountain or a large hill somewhere on which mysterious things are supposed to happen. What is it all about?
Mount Shasta is an old volcanic mountain with a partially still unexplored area in America, or more precisely in Northern California. The mountain is very rocky and extremely difficult to climb. In the interior of the mountain itself is a small city, which is inhabited by descendants of extraterrestrials and which, here and there, also receives a visit from their space brothers from outer space. It is a very majestic race, peaceful and good, but which anxiously strives not to be discovered by Earth humans. The entrance to their very deeply underground city is well camouflaged under the eastern mountain peak, and it is impossible for Earth humans to find it. But if Earth humans are ever found in their proximity, then they are made imperceptibly unable to move or distracted by the beam weapons that most of the city dwellers carry on themselves for security reasons. Their golden spaceships of a spherical form, for they master spaceflight, can sometimes be seen when they do not protect these from view. Human beings of this race are very well proportioned in their appearance. Their hair is mostly natural blonde, long and curly, which is very fit for their graceful, Hyperborean nature. Sometimes, despite their shyness of Earth humans, they go into their villages to conduct unrecognized bartering with them, after which they depart and flee in a great hurry, however, if Earth humans come too close to them. But Mount Shasta is not the only place where this race lives, for already at very early times they divided themselves into 3 smaller peoples, with the other 2 living unrecognized and deep underground on the Aleutian Islands and in Alaska. The whole population amounts to just about 700 human beings.
That is fantastically interesting, and now a few things dawn on me. But you have just said something about their appearance, from which I could infer that with this race living underground it concerns very distant descendants of the real Hyperboreans.
You infer correctly.
Menniken. That is fabulous. Then they would be descendants, or distant descendants, of those who carried out the actual decolonization, 180,000 or 190,000 years ago, in the form that can then be regarded as the prehistory of today's human race, at least for the white race. Among them, then, must have also been the Ishwish who gave Enoch great wisdom. Methuselah went to this one in a later incarnation of Enoch, and Noah was later commissioned by this one's guardian angels to build that ark, with which he actually landed then, on Ararat.
Sure, except that the event, with the building of the ark, which Noah himself did not build, and with his family and with the animals and everything else, became so falsified that no current information agrees with the truth anymore. The events with the ark did truly take place, but at another time, 90,000 years later.
Okay, then I have another question regarding Mount Shasta. I have already talked about this with Sim-Ya-Se, but something still seems unclear to me. Sim-Ya-Se told me that distant descendants of the Hyperboreans now live in Mount Shasta, on the Aleutian Islands, and in Alaska. Enoch, however, and also Emmanuel, spoke of the winds between the east and west, or between the north and west. From this, I always thought that the green land of the Hyperboreans, so Hyperborea, must have been somewhere far up north, in Greenland or something. But now this does not make sense anymore with Mount Shasta. What should I now think of this?
At the time of Enoch, the North Pole was situated differently than what is the case today. Through cosmic influences and through an upset of the Earth, the North Pole at that time shifted far to the west. The central point of the North Pole at that time is identical to present-day Florida in America. The polar regions at the time of Enoch were wondrous landscapes filled with palms and other tropical vegetation. You would say that it was paradise on Earth, for it had the most favorable climate of your world. Golden apples flourished and ripened there. These are simply called oranges today. In the timelessly young nature of Hyperborea, an uninterrupted summer prevailed, and it was also called the land of timeless youth. The most delicious fruits thrived there, like nowhere else on the earth. The average annual temperature in the land of Hyperborea was 26.7 degrees of your measuring values, and the coldest season never sank below the value of 21.9 degrees of your current values. Similar conditions can still be found today in the former Hyperborea, so in Florida.
That is fantastic, but can you tell me exactly where at the North Pole this Hyperborea lay?
It lay exactly where the land is still called Greenland today, whereby the actual North Pole of that time is not identical with today's North Pole.
So Greenland, because as far as I know, this is called Grunland in German.
That is so Tirnanog lay there.
What is that?
Greenland and Land of Youth. But at that time it was today's Florida.
So then Heracles, Gilgamesh, Enoch, Emmanuel, Amitabha, Methuselah, and Noah and all others were up there and not in Florida.
In Hyperborea in Florida, when it was still at the spot where today the land still means grassland. But Emmanuel was not there because he was already in Florida, where it is to be found today.
Ah, of course, he did not live until much later. But in connection with the Hyperboreans, I still come to another question, namely about the legendary Agartha. Are you also oriented about this, and can you give me more details about it?
You surprise me again and again. How is the right name familiar to you? To my knowledge, the humanity of Earth still lives in error regarding the name of Agartha. In general, it is still erroneously called Agarthi.
You forget that I was in India and in the Himalayas for a long time, and also encountered the blue human beings.
That is why. I should know that. Unfortunately, I cannot give you exhaustive information in an open form because certain things still have to remain confidential. However, this much may be said, that in the vicinity of Shigatse and Shampula is the underground realm of Agartha, the capital and center of distant descendants of extraterrestrials on the Earth. This is the center of the actual secrets that hold a gigantic power in themselves. This city is controlled by the race of the Sons of the Sun. But unfortunately, a tendency toward earthly world domination also prevails with this race, just like with certain earthly religions and secret societies. I may not explain anything else about it openly.
Contact Report 69.
Aha! Were the gods and demigods of Greek mythology such settlers from space?
Sure, they were a splinter group of descendants of the Hyperboreans.
Oh, well, now I understand to some extent the connections. Good old Heracles said some very wondrous things, which just refer to it. But now I wonder how big these Hyperborean descendants must have been. Because with Ascot, I once had the opportunity to see something that will probably remain closed to the Earth human forever. And exactly according to what I saw, these Greek mythology gods or demigods must have been several meters tall. Heracles alone must have measured about 3 meters, right?
Sure.
Well, then is it also correct that Noah was around 3.10 meters tall, while Adam actually measured around 5 meters?
Sure. Only Adam was less than 5 meters tall. He was still a little more than a meter shorter than that measure.
You are pedantic. It really does not matter anymore. But now I am surprised how big Gilgamesh was, actually king and demigod. According to Sumerian tradition, he would have measured more than 7 meters if I used the big old cubit, ancient unit of measure, shire to length of forearm, ulna. But according to the small cubit, it would have been only a little more than 3 meters. Which measurement is correct now? Can you tell me that?
Sure, it is the big ulna with which you have to measure.
Well, then Gilgamesh was about 7.50 meters tall, was that right?
That is correct, except for a few centimeters.
You are driving me crazy. Why are you so pedantic today?
You want exact data.
Well, now, not that accurate.
Then I misunderstood you.
That is all right. Now it only makes me wonder why it is always claimed, even by you, that our ancestors and who knows how many great-great-great ancestors were normal people. Giants and titans, and I do not know what else can be called normal, at least not for our terms.
Sure, but I had to get used to it first. All human races grow normally according to our terminology, but not according to yours. There may have been some misunderstandings, which I hereby clarify. Every human race grows normally in its type, and only grows abnormally when degenerations appear in its own race.
Why did you not say that earlier?
You are mistaken, because we have talked about different races of humans on several occasions, and I slowly began with the gradations according to earthly understanding.
Accepted.
Contact Report 70.
You may be right. But now the other thing, where we are also interested in the history of the Aryans. If you know anything about it,
Sure. At which events should I start?
start where the earliest ancestors were still in their original home. Name the time when they first came to Earth, etc.
As you wish. So, at the beginning of our contacts, I have already mentioned in detail the history of the destruction and reconstruction of the original home worlds, the
Excuse me. You mean the destruction of worlds, etc. by the Destroyer? Where was that actually?
Sure, that is what I am talking about. The later original home worlds were planets in the constellation known to you as Lyra and near Vega, in a different space-time structure, which is shifted from yours by a fraction of a second. Few of the worlds there are still inhabited today by different races, all belonging to our wide alliance. Our early ancestors had mastered space travel for more than 22 million years, carried out expeditions and exploratory flights, reaching far into space, and came to Earth for the first time. However, the Earth, was still deep in the late primordial development and was therefore left to time for the further development. Nonetheless, Earth was often revisited to release criminal elements, humans, that were detrimental on the home worlds. Only a few millennia, however, did this last, and then, for reasons unknown to us, they relinquished the Earth and left this world alone for many millions of years, during which life of all kinds, already developed on Earth, could continue to develop in a natural sense, except that at later times the abandoned life forms mixed with human-like life forms already on Earth, which happened for the first time a few million years ago. Millions of years went by as the primeval races spread far into space, also developed themselves in a consciousness-based manner and acquired great powers. But not yet mastering control of these, they were used to doing evil things and became evil for many worlds. During the primeval catastrophes caused by the Destroyer, 2/3 of humankind were destroyed on the very early original homeworlds in another level of the universe. Through hardship and privation, however, they soon found a new beginning, so they were able to build a new civilization and culture in less than 9 centuries. By working and researching together, they created a very great technology, which reached further than anything they had ever seen before. At the same time, they also developed their consciousness, the powers of which they were not yet able to control. So the time came when they built themselves flying ships, with which they could also leave their space-time structure and could rush through the free and wide space of the levels of the universe. These were flying apparatuses of disc-like form and with beam drives. With these devices, they flew out into the vastness of the universe, to other solar systems and planets, which they had expeditions to and colonized, either peacefully or through murderous wars. Often with evil violence, they created new life possibilities and new living space for themselves because they needed it due to the proliferation of the human beings of their peoples. It was especially the scientists who searched space for ever new worlds and solar systems. And it was no problem for them, because their ships were equipped with all technological possibilities which made them absolute rulers. Their weapons were of immense power and prowess, so battles with whole peoples of foreign worlds were only very short and one-sided in favor of the conquerors. In particular, the scientists recognized, in the course of time, the unlimited possibilities of their consciousness-based powers, so they pushed and expanded them by immense accumulations of knowledge until they became a matter of course for them, and they swung themselves even higher up, whereby they soon became absolutely dominant over their peoples. According to their great knowledge, they were called Yeshwish, Ishwish, which is synonymous with the name God, which is familiar to you and which means King of Wisdom. The Jeshwish, far superior to all people in terms of knowledge and ability, subjugated all life forms, cast a spell over them, and ruled them in a dictatorial form. For several centuries, exactly after 864 years of today's terrestrial era, the people rose up in a revolution that at first smoldered underground, but this led to the Jeshwish taking violent measures and trying to nip everything in the bud, which did not succeed completely. The domineers killed innumerable human beings or simply eliminated them completely with their terrible weapons, so that not a single speck of dust remained. This, however, increased the anger of the people, and underground they were secretly preparing for battle. Preparations took 4 long centuries in secret form to break out in one sudden blow into a far-reaching and open war of liberation, which spread and dragged on over many other dimensioned worlds of the Lyra and Vega systems. More than 60% of all things of cultural value were destroyed and completely demolished. Some races were completely wiped out, while others were only able to survive with extreme hardship. 3 worlds of the Lyra systems were simply completely eliminated and dissolved into energy by a novel process that is now also under development on the Earth in its very beginnings. Earth humans already call this insane weapon according to its deadly value, namely overkill. Still as a fantasy product of a perfect technology, this weapon of total elimination, which is in research and construction by scientists, has already found entrance into various books and films describing this cruelest of all weapons in futuristic novels to save Earth humans from the last madness. According to the terrestrial calendar, the event of the outbreak of the War of Liberation in the Lyra and Vega systems dates back some 230,000 years. The commander-in-chief of the terrorizing forces was an Jeshwish called Azael, who, after realizing the hopelessness of the struggle, escaped the vengeful and victorious peoples by a quick escape into the space-time structure of this level of the universe. Secretly, he managed to seize a powerful fleet of 183 large ships and 250 space reconnaissance ships, with a total crew of 360,000 human beings, and to escape under the most severe combat actions. They quickly left the home systems, only to wander through the again-shifted space-time structures for many restless years, before one day they found a large star system, which offered them the necessary possibilities for life, far away from their original home systems. The new star system encompassed 3,000 light-years and 254 partly still young and therefore blue shining suns, which partly, however, already had their own planetary systems with only a few habitable planets. The whole star system was named after the leader of the escape fleet, namely, according to your word value, Asael's system. After taking possession of this young star system, where various planets had been made habitable by the Titanic fugitives over the course of 300 years, and a new humanity had been created, they set out again in larger groups to explore space and develop new habitats. Of the 3 worlds made habitable, various expedition ships were equipped, after which the Titan fugitives flew out into the vastness of space to reach and take possession of their predetermined destination after 17 years. These were stars and planets in their dimension beyond those stars known to you as Hesperides, which have their own worlds circling around them and were only weakly inhabited by human life forms, which were subjugated by the conquerors. During 2 centuries, a new culture was created on these differently dimensioned Hesperid worlds and inhabited by emigrants from the Asael system. Another 70 years later, Asel walked the path of all transience. He died. He was succeeded by his daughter Plearya and Jayshrish, female queen of knowledge, goddess, and consequently the home system, the Asel system, was also renamed the Plearya system, because for the human beings of that time, who were Titans, symbolization was still very much in force, as it still is today with the human beings of the earth, which corresponds to a perverse illogicity. Under the supreme command of the new leader, Plearya, further expeditions were prepared to expedite a very distant and lonely solar system, located in this, your space-time plane, which, according to all calculations, must have come into possession of a section of a planet from the original earliest home systems, after the destroyer had destroyed the earliest original home worlds many millions of years ago. According to the calculations, however, the destroyer itself must also have taken the same orbit. Thus, it had been changed in its orbit by the sun of the distant system and had been introduced into the system in a recurring orbit. These calculations were like a hint for the Titans, which is why they set off for the distant system, not knowing that their ancestors had already flown to this system and abandoned undesirable elements on a world millions of years before, namely on the Earth, your homeworld. So the expedition ships set off again, and after many years reached the SOL system, where they forced 3 different planets under their rule and began to build a new culture. However, these planets, Earth, Melona and Mars, were still extremely inhospitable and hostile to life, so the majority of the expedition fleet left the worlds again after a few years, leaving only a few behind, who slowly faded away and joined the animal-looking feral descendants of those earlier abandoned ones millions of years ago, as well as the pure Earth-born ones. The scientists of the Plearya system, like their earliest ancestors, left the Earth to its natural development, making expeditions and monitoring visits only here and there, and then leaving the human beings who had become completely wild and were now left there to their hard fate. This lasted many thousands of years. Then, when the idolism had been abolished in the Plearya systems and the leader Plearya had died, a new intelligence developed on the Earth through the descendants of the feral abandoned ones, which led to the fact that the Plearya system inhabitants, who were constantly observing the Earth, came forward with new expeditions to Earth and once again built up a culture in the same manner as they built up a culture on the 4th planet, namely on the world of Melona. Still very barbarically inclined, however, power struggles broke out again among the new settlers after less than 300 years, which led to the fact that the Earth had to be vacated by an order under force from the home systems. Melona, on the other hand, remained inhabited because the population there remained peaceful. But this only lasted for barely 40 years, and then the greed for power among the 2 different peoples also took hold there, And before any orders could be made from the home systems, the Melonians destroyed each other and destroyed the whole planet. Since then, the debris of the once beautiful planet between Mars and Jupiter has been orbiting the Sol, the system's sun, as a long-lasting memorial to human madness. From the homeworlds, the development of the Earth has been constantly monitored, and expeditions have been sent to it year after year. Again and again, attempts were also made to repopulate this very beautiful world, but these failed miserably time and again over the course of more than 800 years. All kinds of life forms were deported to Earth, also those you would call prisoners, to simply abandon them there and leave them to their fate. Robbed of all technology, it was inevitable that they would wither and become overgrown, mixed again with the overgrown descendants of earlier elements and with Earth humans, and became bestial. But then the time finally came when the great enterprise was finally taken up. With several hundred large and small spaceships, the Earth was once again approached and seized. A great culture was built up, which lasted for 600 years before the greed for power among the highly ambitious scientists increased again and led to new terrible acts of war, whereby once again everything was destroyed to the last. The Earth reverted to its old existence, where life forms continued to exist, but quickly became wild. For 400 years, the Earth was completely unnoticed and left to its own devices before it was approached again. This time, however, it was no longer an attempt at an expedition, but once again an escape. On the home worlds in the Pleiades star systems, power struggles broke out once again between the ascending scientists and the peoples, who were enslaved by their terrible weapons and other means. But, while on all three homeworlds, the vicious battles of annihilation raged, a large group of dissident scientists came together under the leadership of a certain Pelagon, who already had the status of an Ishwish. Under his leadership, 70,000 human beings were gathered, including many scientists who seized various spaceships and fled the Plejaria planets. According to the coordinates of old records, the refugees entered this space-time structure and the SOL system, and thus once again arrived on Earth, where the Titans once again settled. According to earthly time calculation, this was about 190,000 years ago. On the home planets, the vicious war was fought to the bitter end, and the scientists were put in their place. The form of government was abolished and placed in the hands of spiritual leaders who proclaimed anew the long-forgotten spiritual teaching and taught the peoples. These recognized the value of the teaching, took it to their own hands, and henceforth lived according to it, after which they found final peace some 50,000 years ago, and henceforth lived according to the law and recommendation of absolute creational determination, which has been preserved until today and will never change again. In the course of the next 8,000 years, the Pleiaran peoples, as they were referred to from then on, developed to a very high spiritual and consciousness-based level. Consequently, they allied themselves with all kinds of foreign and their own peoples in near and far systems and lived now only in the harmonious evolution. Thus, they developed together into a great alliance, in the course of which they carried out new expeditions and, 51 years ago, found in the galaxy of Andromeda a half-spirit world inhabited by half-spirit beings, an already extremely highly developed life form, which existed and exists only half-materially, but therefore already half-spiritually. In best agreement with these life forms, everything was resolved that they should in future guide the destinies of their peoples and their great covenant with their gigantic knowledge and wisdom, which was joyfully welcomed by all peoples. Consequently, in agreement with the spiritual leaders, who were human life forms and spiritual teachers, it was decided that all destinies of the future should be guided by these half-spiritual forms which had become best friends. The form of guidance should be that of a counsel from a higher spiritual level, which is why this guidance and advice was referred to as the High Council, which has survived to this day and will never change again. Since then, all folks of all races connected to us have been under the guidance of the High Council, which never gives any orders, but only a High Council, which is optional for each individual form of life to follow, and which, as a rule, is also followed without exception. Those who fled to the earth knew nothing of the end of the wars for the time being. In the joy of their newly won freedom, they gladly submitted to the tight regime of Pelagon, who had chosen 200 scientists as sub-leaders and deployed them according to their fields of knowledge. Under their leadership emerged large cities with other inhabited areas, and a very high culture developed on all the continents of the earth, which had resulted from continental shifts over about 300 million years. For about 10,000 years, harmony and peace reigned. But then again, an Jeshwish called Jesus came out, who murdered Pelagon's successor and seized power over all the, by then, united different folks and races. 20 years later, however, the folk rose up against Jesus, and a terrible and worldwide war broke out again over the earth by those who had traveled farther. Many hundreds of thousands fled with large and small ships into free space, set down and settled in another space-time structure in Beta Centaurus, which you know in your space-time structure as the Barnard Star. A few million humans remained on the Earth, where everything that had been built by the extraterrestrial humans had been completely destroyed and totally eliminated. Those left behind, deprived of all technical and other cultural possibilities by the complete total destruction, gradually fell into a wicked lethargy, atrophied and became wild beings in a nasty barbarism. For 700 years, the earth was simply avoided before the descendants of the fugitives set out again to populate the beautiful blue world again. This was 133,000 Earth years ago, according to your current chronology. The returnees were led by an Jeshwish with the name Atlant, married to an Jeshrish named Caryatide. In the latest episode, under the leadership of Atlant, the continent of Atlantis, which had been headed for again and again, and used for millennia, was expanded and made habitable, while under the command of his wife Caryatide, Lesser Atlantis came into existence, as at the same time her cousin Muras built the gigantic city of Mu, which, like Atlantis, also found its origin in very early times. The reason for the construction of these cities so far apart was that the humans had become cleverer through all the wars and hoped for peace as a result of the great distance between the cities, if everyone stayed in their domains. So it went well for many long years, a whole 1,800 years to be precise. Then, however, again some scientists exalted themselves, whipped up by lust for might, and tried to snatch up control for themselves. This time, however, they had not reckoned on the people's memory of war, which had been passed down over the ages. So before the scientists could strike, the folk rose up against them. Through an accomplice, the scientists obtained possession of spaceships and fled into the space-time-shifted regions of Beta Centauri. This was 115,000 Earth years ago. After 2,000 years, during which the malicious refugees again created a high technological standard and produced many descendants, they returned filled with hate to the earth, after they had increased their hate immeasurably against the extraterrestrial inhabitants of the earth, and were only able to preserve order within their own ranks with terrible punishments. Spurred on through their inhuman hate, they, through research and the knowledge obtained from it, drove up their life expectancy to more than 1,000 years. Their single wish was, however, to gain control over the earth, for which reason every individual was taught wicked intrigues and was instructed in the craft of war. After 2,000 years, this hate-drenched people was so far along that it could venture an attack on the earth. Therefore, it manned its ships and came newly to the earth, and indeed under the leadership of the Jeshvish Arus, the barbarian. This happened 113,000 years ago. Eris was extremely bestial and barbarous in his disposition, and his power was feared. Like Pelagon, already thousands of years before, Eris also had 200 high-level scientists with him, who he made sub-leaders. In a lightning action, they fell upon the earth, robbing, murdering, and taking possession of the land. Primarily, they conquered the distant land in the northern regions, where the climate was moderate and very good. These were those regions which are traditionally known to you as Hyperborea, and which were far in the north before an upset of the earth shifted its axis, so that the then regions exist today where you name Florida. Coming from the north, Aris's son, Aris II, set out and fell upon those lands which today you call India, Pakistan and Persia, and so forth, whereby they struck the earliest forefathers of the Sumerians, who, peace-loving, fled and set down far in the south, folk of dark-colored skin, but by your terms, not Negroid, but like Europeans and of tall growth, risen from a race of former Syrian refugees who had likewise settled on the earth 133,000 years ago, as did the refugees from the Plei-Aran system. Named after Aris II, the India of today was at that time called Aryan, which, however, split off from Hyperborea after a few centuries, after 210 years, to be exact, and joined with the inhabitants of Mu and Agartha, while from Hyperborea, Eris I constantly troubled Mu and Greater Atlantis by wicked war activities in order to become their ruler. During around half a millennia, or said very precisely, during 502 years, those war machinations continued, until Eris I, who in the meanwhile had become old and weak, succeeded in infiltrating wicked elements of his hater humans into the leading controlling ranks of Atlantis and Mu, who secretly stirred up violence and hate for so long, as also did their descendants over several centuries, until, through boundless intrigues, Mu and Atlantis were able to be completely destroyed some centuries later, while the only few survivors were beaten into servitude. However, great scientists, in knowledge of the coming things and conscious of their powerlessness, set off in spaceships and fled towards the early homeworlds in the Plei-Aran systems, where they were affably received. I indeed do not need to speak yet again about the destruction of Atlantis and Mu, because you will find that as a separate chronicle in the explanations given to you. So it only remains for me to report that Eris XI, as a very distant descendant of Aris I, was murdered in his old age many thousands of years later, and around 100,000 years after the destruction of Mu and Atlantis, by his third-born son Jehavan, after which this one took over command of the Hater people, in order to rule these and 3 earthly peoples and the Hyperboreans himself. The one Earth folk consisted of the very distant descendants of the Armus folks who had lived where the region of Armenia is today. These were descendants of the Jeshvish Armus, who settled there with his race 133,000 years ago after he had emigrated from the Plei-Aran systems. The second Earth folk which fell under Jehavan's control were the descendants of the Aryans, who meanwhile had mingled themselves with the still very underdeveloped, pure earthly and lethargic native population after the Sumerians were expelled. The third Earth humans were not really such a people in themselves, because they were a very widely disseminated alliance of gypsies which was interspersed with Jehavan spies and saboteurs, who, in unity with the gypsies, brought about dissension everywhere, greedily drawing everything to themselves and were always constantly eager to murder, burn, and rob, for which reason one named them the Hebrons by the original language of our forefathers, therefore Hebraion, and later then Hebrons. These names correspond to gypsy, scum and outcast in the sense of the original language, which therefore has not been transferred to your present languages because the sense of your present term for gypsy still only means the wanderers, the itinerant, and the unsettled ones. Thereby it should be clarified that the present gypsy people have not the least in common with the Hebraian of that time, who proclaimed themselves the firstborn and the chosen ones just as much as do their distant descendants, who today still dare to assert this. In truth, the Hebraians were the real scum and outcasts of Earth humanity, because through them fights and quarrels within the whole world were constantly stirred up and yet further spread, which has been maintained until the present day. Earth will only finally be at peace. Then, when this power-hungry and bloodthirsty Hebraian alliance, which has declared themselves as a people, and which has split into various sects addicted to world control and so forth, has been fully dissolved. Jehavan ruled until about 3,060 Earth years ago, until he was likewise treacherously murdered by his only son Jehav, who then snatched up rule for himself after 340 years of his father's reign. Jehav ruled wickedly and always screamed for blood and revenge until 3,320 years ago in your chronology, during which time he sired 3 sons, who were named Arusam, Ptah, and Salam. Megalomaniacal like his father Jehavan, he let himself be proclaimed as creator and celebrated as such, and like his father, he caused terrible devastation among the 3 human races, and he demanded blood and death. As addicted to power as his father Jehav was also his firstborn son Arusam, who constantly wanted to take over his father's power. Thus he also finally murdered his father Jehav and wanted to snatch up the power for himself. But he failed profoundly, because his younger brother Ptah and his youngest brother Salam positioned themselves against him in order to expel and ban him into exile, because, having become disgusted by the constant wars, power struggles, and bloodshed, Ptah and Salam already made an effort themselves for many decades to lead humane forms of life. Therefore, already for a long time, they assembled around themselves many like-minded ones, with whose help they gained control of Arusam and his 72,000 followers, and expelled them. But Arusam secretly returned to the earth and settled down with his army in the land of Egypt, in the old cubicle constructions which had existed there unused for more than 70,000 years. Deep in the interior of the earth and deep below the pyramids, they established themselves securely, whereby they converted the rooms and buildings deep below the present pyramids of Giza as a center for their wicked purposes, from where they and their descendants since then tried to realize their tyrannical plans, but as of now without noteworthy success, although their way of obtaining the goal of deceit, lying, and intrigues was through false teachings and the leading astray of the uncorrupted earth humans through religious teachings of madness and cults, and many kinds of other evil machinations. Due to their expulsion, they, however, forfeited very much, because all possibilities for technological and otherwise scientific further development was prevented for them, as also, however, was all their research, and so forth, which thereby led to the quite rapid reduction in their life expectancy, and today still only amounts to an average of 94 years, which in relation to today's people converts to practically only about 20 years higher than the average in European regions. This means for the renegades, called the Giza intelligences by us, that they are slowly dying out, and today are still only fewer than 2,100 in number. Due to complete isolation from outer space, these remaining ones will also be no more in fewer than 3 decades, because they are all already old and no longer capable of procreation. But in spite of that, they still maliciously hold firm to their tyrannical plans, and they do not see themselves as beaten. Arusum ruled until about 3,010 years before your time reckoning began, 3010 BCE, until a powerful forced departure was secured for him by a mutineer by the name of Hen, who was called Jehovah in the tongue of the Hebraeans, and likewise also gradually within his own ranks, whereas the appellation the Cruel One was added. In the year 2080 BCE, already old and weak, he was displaced, and his nephew, Kamagol I, took over the evil command of the Giza intelligences in order to expand the headquarters below the surface of the Pyramid of Giza to a murderous center of power, which allowed no possibility at all of being destroyed anymore. Like no ruler before, Kamagol I forced all earthly religions under his control and created terrible cults which demanded human blood, which were able to be partially maintained until the present. All efforts from outside were in vain, as his position of power could not be broken. But also, Kamagol I was only a human, so one day he met his own fate from out of his own ranks, in the form of his own son, Kamagol II, who overthrew him and deprived him of power, and let him die miserably in a deep dungeon. Kamagol II was in many things even more malicious than his father, which he soon revealed, after taking over power through the introduction of monstrous mass murdering of earth-born terrestrial human beings who he slapped under his religious power through many kinds of means. As one of the last really extremely long-lived, Kamagol II attained a great age and died a natural death just a few days ago, which we were able to ascertain just 2 days ago. He departed this world on the 27th of December, 1976, therefore around 10 days ago. The still remaining Giza intelligences, already old and weak in many cases, but still filled with hate and tyrannical plans, do not give up. But indeed their days are numbered, so in 3 decades at the latest they will be no more. With the heaven sons, the Hyperboreans, and the emigrants from the Pleiaren system, Ptah and Salam, the sons of the murdered Jehav, led the further rule by common agreement. They governed well and created peace, and only occasionally mixed in the affairs of the earth-born earth-humans. After his 93rd year of government, Ptah was stricken by a malicious and unknown disease, from which he succumbed a few days later. Consequently, his brother Salam continued to lead the government alone, until, weak from his great age, he handed over command to his son Plejos, 2040 Earth years ago, after he had taken up connections to the home worlds already centuries before and had placed himself and his people under the home form of government, namely that of the spiritual teachers. His son Plejos was, like his father, a very wise and a kind governor, and as of 1999 years ago of earthly chronology, the homeworlds, after an interruption of around 240 years, newly positioned themselves under the guidance of the High Council. He too arranged himself and his people therein. Respecting and following the advice of the High Council, he prepared for the long-yearned-for return to the homeworlds, which took place 1,994 years ago by your chronology, after Emmanuel, at Plejos's direction, begat by the spiritual leader Gabriel, was educated as a prophet and had become right for his mission. Still to mention is that among the very distant descendants of Arus, who had subjugated the lands in the north, There existed elements in great number, who, until in the time of Jahav, preserved themselves as the Arusists. These, a group of 160,000 humans, were named the Great Aryans because they still advocated the ideas of Arus I. They even released themselves from the powerful control of Jahav and wandered, plundering, through the land, from northwest to the east, where they penetrated into that land where in earlier times Eris II had settled with his people and expelled the Sumerians, where in the meantime, however, the then Aryans mixed themselves with the low native population and forgot their actual origin. Also in the meantime, the descendants of the Sumerians returned to their old homeland, so also they settled there again. But then came the Great Aryans, who moved between the Caspian Sea and Ararat, and took possession of the clay-brick towns of the mixed folks, which had reached a good level of prosperity as a result of the earlier invading Aryans and the returning descendants of the Sumerians. Their work consisted mainly of trade and agriculture, which was well mastered by the Sumerian descendants. So, the appearance of the human beings and all their buildings was very orderly, and a strict discipline ruled. Indeed, even a certain submissiveness towards the highly developed Sumerian descendants, who were superior to the native people in consciousness-based development and worldliness. And exactly this world was attacked and forced into bondage and transformed and pressed into a new state structure by the Aryans, who, deprived of all technology, had been wandering for long years, coming from the far north. Deprived of all technology by Jahav's Myrmidons, the Aryans settled down in the distant lands, but in time became stunted and mixed with the natives. So soon all knowledge and ability of a higher level and of their origin disappeared into the darkness of forgetfulness.
Contact Report 703.
Yes, I know, Edward. But greetings to you too, and thanks for your welcome. Florina and Njana have sent me various things to read, which will now take some time if I am to answer them in some detail.
I suppose it will, especially just this in relation to the 70th contact report, which still goes back to statements made by your daughter Simya-se. Some people suspect errors in it, while others are probably trying to find errors and inconsistencies in it, which is why I thought some things should be cleared up by you.
This is as it has always been, because there are also persons at work here who either suspect faults or have doubts about everything. But on the other hand, there are also always elements who suspect lies and deceit behind everything and think they are predestined to have to uncover fraud. But for this matter now arising, which has absolutely no errors because the information provided by my daughter Simya-se is correct, I have decided for once, it will not be another time, to provide some clarification. This is because, on the one hand, the questioners obviously do not think far enough when historical facts are told, that they usually come about with historical time interruptions and with factual shifts, as a result of which certain facts are omitted, others are unclearly expressed or shifted. This was also the case with Simya-se when she revealed to you some of our ancient Playaran history, which I will now clarify in some detail. And to do this, you should open the corresponding 70th conversation report section in the computer, which Njana and Florina also copied and handed over to me. I will now give you all the necessary explanations at the relevant parts of the conversation report, which you should immediately insert into the existing copy report. On the other hand, it is also the case that know-it-alls and adversaries always work towards describing any ambiguities, which arise precisely through narrative facts, as lies and deception, because they are hopelessly trapped in their know-it-all and adversary stupidity, as well as in their pathological antagonist delusion, and are incapable of judgment.
That is certainly as you say, and I do not think we need to say any more about that. But good, the computer is already switched on, and the corresponding excerpt of the conversation. Wait, there it is. So you are good to go.
You are only to write what I say and not ask any questions, because I only want to dictate and state what you are to insert in writing, explaining at the appropriate places.
I think it will be good if I write all that you explain in red.
This will be good, then it gives a good overview, and you can start here at sentence 89 and write the following.
But while the vicious extermination battles were raging on all three homeworlds, a large group of dissident scientists came together under the leadership of a certain Pelagon, who already had the status of a Jeshwish.
This was the Titan Pelagon the Imperious, who was a power leader of the Hammud dynasty, which ruled over all the Pleiaran peoples of all the Pleiaran planets until before the creation of peace some 52,000 years ago.
Under his leadership, 70,000 human beings, including a great many scientists, gathered together, seized various spaceships, and fled from the Pleiaran planets. According to the coordinates of ancient records, the refugees arrived in this space-time structure and the SOL system, and thus once again to Earth, where the Titans settled once more. According to earthly chronology, this was about 190,000 years ago, about 194,770 years.
The unpeaceful, warlike times triggered by Pelagon the Commanding and continued by all his successors for some 39,000 years meant that peace and tranquility did not arrive until some 150,000 years ago, but they did not last long. Millennia later, some 6,000 years after the establishment of peace, tranquility and freedom, however, a scientist and distant descendant of Pelagon the Commanding, named Pelagon the Militant, again set out, in imitation, to likewise rise in rebellious fashion as the leader of a 70,000-strong fighting force in thrall to him. These fighting units were a 70,000-strong fighting force out of 7 since time immemorial, permanently mobile for security operations and combat actions, each under the command of a Hammud dynasty leader appointed for the purpose. Pelagon the Commanding was a great-great-great-great ancestor of Pelagon the Militant, who some 40,000 years later, that is to say some 150,000 years ago, equally brought a 70,000-strong fighting unit under his command and fled to the Dern universe. This occurred while his son, Pelagon the Marshal, was seizing power on the home planets at the same time. Pelagon the Marshal was a scientist and surrounded by many followers and also leader of another 70,000-strong Hammud dynasty fighting force with which he plunged worlds into warfare again, as was then continued by all his numerous successors. These periods of strife then continued for more than 100,000 years. When Pelagon the Militant, the father of Pelagon the Marshal, seized several capital ships with the help of his combat unit and fled, the dimensional gate had already existed at that time for about 30 million years, which he used and transported with his combat unit to various inhabited solar, that is to say, planetary systems in the Dern universe, and finally also reached Earth. Here, however, in the course of time, feuds and campaigns of conquest broke out among a part of the fighters, as well as acts of war were carried out, after which it was finally decided by a part of the prudent ones that no longer a longer stay on the planet should be allowed for the fighters. So, following the death of Pelagon the Marshal, who was killed in hostilities, a general forced departure from Earth of the unruly and quarrelsome outcasts took place with the destruction of everything that indicated their former existence. But the outcasts fled to distant systems where they resettled, while those who remained on Earth fell under the command and Hammud leadership of Pelagon the Patriarchal.
On the home planets, the vicious war was fought to the bitter end, and the scientists were put in their place. The form of government was abolished and placed in the hands of spirit leaders, who reproclaimed the long-forgotten spiritual teachings and taught the peoples. These recognized the value of the teaching, adopted it and lived by it from then on, after which they found final peace some 50,000 years ago, and from then on lived according to the law and commandment of absolute creative destiny, which has remained so to this day and will never change.
The times of strife and war ended only about 52,000 years ago, when the unrest and battles were finally fought out for the last time. Ended, and all the troublemakers and warmongers were finally put in their place, and then final peace, freedom, and tranquility were created. So the unrest and warfare which, after the short period of peace lasting only about 6,000 years, 150,000 years ago, lasted again for more than 100,000 years, after which, about 52,000 years ago, the peace, freedom, and tranquility which has lasted until today, and will certainly last in the future, was actually created. However, during the 100,000 years of unrest and warfare, many events also followed, which were triggered by the refugees under Pelagon the Militant on Earth, where they had found their way. After the death of Pelagon the Militant, other Hamud leaders took over his legacy, after which the early refugees and their successors went in and out of Earth from 150,000 years ago until 52,000 years ago, and were also temporarily resident on Earth.
In the course of the next 8,000 years, the Pleiaren folks, as they were called from then on, developed to a very high spiritual and consciousness level, as a result of which they allied themselves with all kinds of foreign and own peoples in near and far systems, and lived in harmony only of evolution. Thus they developed together into a great alliance, as a result of which they carried out new expeditions, and 51,951 years ago of the terrestrial calendar found a half-spirit world in the galaxy of Andromeda, which was inhabited by half-spirit beings, an already extremely highly developed life form, which existed and still exists only semi-materially, but therefore already half-spiritually. In best agreement with these life forms, all agreed that in future they should guide the destinies of their peoples and their great covenant with their gigantic knowledge and wisdom, which was joyfully welcomed by all peoples. Consequently, in agreement with the spirit guides, who were human life forms and spirit teachers, it was decided that all destinies should henceforth be directed by these half-spirit forms who had made themselves the best of friends. The form of guidance was to be that of a council from a higher spirit level, which is why this guidance and leadership was called High Council, which has remained so to this day and will never change. Since then, all peoples of all races connected with us have been under the guidance of the High Council, which never gives any orders, but only a High Council, which each individual life form is free to follow, and which is also usually followed without exception. For the time being, those who had fled to Earth knew nothing of the end of the wars.
These refugees were Titans and the most distant descendants of the 70,000 refugees of Pelagon the Imperious, who brought them from the Pleiaren planets to the Dern universe and the SOL system to Earth more than 190,000 years ago.
In the joy of their newfound freedom, they gladly submitted to Pelagon's tight regiment, who had chosen 200 scientists as sub-leaders and assigned them according to their fields of knowledge.
Pelagon the Patriarchal was the first successor leader to carry on the legacy of Pelagon the Commanding, who was then followed by various other Hamud leaders.
Under their leadership, large cities and other inhabited areas with a very high culture were created on Earth on all continents that had been formed only about 300 million years ago by continental drift. For about 10,000 years, there was harmony and peace. But then a new Joshuish named Jesus arose, who murdered Pelagon's successor and seized power over all the different peoples and races united at that time. After only 20 years, however, the people rose up against Assays, and a terrible and worldwide war broke out again over the earth through the far travelers. Many hundreds of thousands fled into open space, in ships large and small, and settled in another space-time structure near Beta Centaurus, which you know in your space-time structure as Barnard's star.
This was not in the Dern universe space-time structure, but in the one where the Pleiaran planets also exist.
A few million human beings remained on Earth, where everything that had been built by the extraterrestrial human beings had been completely destroyed and totally eliminated. Those left behind, deprived of all technical and other cultural possibilities by the total destruction, gradually fell into an evil lethargy, withered away and became savage beings in an evil barbarism.
All knowledge of their original origins and highly developed technology was lost, and their former high development of consciousness atrophied almost completely, with the result that in the course of time, the 2.5 million feral titans largely exterminated themselves and became cannibals.
For 700 years, Earth was simply avoided before the descendants of the fugitives set out again to repopulate the beautiful blue world.
These new arrivals, or the distant descendants of those who had left the Earth earlier, were on the one hand not titans, but human beings of smaller dimensions. But they too were not exactly of a peaceful nature, but nevertheless no longer as warlike as their ancestors.
This was 133,000 Earth years ago, according to today's calendar. The leadership of the returners had a Yishish named Atlant, married to a Yishish named Caryatide. Under the leadership of Atlant, the continent of Atlantis, which had been approached and used again and again for many millennia, was expanded and made habitable, while under the rule of his wife, Caryatide, Klein Atlantis found its existence, at the same time that through her cousin Muras, the gigantic city of Mu was built, which, like Atlantis, also found its origin at very early times. The reason for building these cities at such a great distance was that the human beings had become wiser through all the wars and hoped for peace in the great distances of the cities if all remained in their realms. So it also went well for many years, a whole 1,800 years, to be exact. Then, however, a few scientists, inflamed by the desire for power, rose up again and tried to seize the reins.
After the death of Atlant, his wife Caryatide, and Muras, various other leaders took over.
This time, however, they had not reckoned with the people's war memory, which had been handed down through the ages.
The lore was only maintained by those who returned, but not by those who remained on Earth, who were deprived of all achievements and values by a complete destruction of all technical, cultural, and other things, whereby they finally gradually withered away and became savage beings who fell into barbarism and eventually died out.
Before the scientists could strike, the people rose up against them. Through helpers, the scientists who started the new uprising gained possession of starships and fled to the space-time displaced areas near Beta Centaurus. That was 115,000 Earth years ago. After 2,000 years, during which the malicious fugitives again created a high technology for themselves and begat many descendants, they returned to Earth filled with hatred after they had increased their hatred against the extraterrestrial Earth inhabitants to an immeasurable extent and were only able to maintain order in their own ranks with terrible punishments. Incited by their inhuman hatred, they pushed up their age to more than 1,000 years through research and the knowledge they gained through it. Their only desire, however, was to gain dominion over the earth, for which reason every one of them was instructed in vicious intrigues and in the craft of war. After 2,000 years, this hate-soaked people had reached the point where they could dare to attack Earth, so they manned their ships and came to Earth once more under the leadership of Ishwish Eris, the barbarian. This happened 113,000 years ago. Eris was of a most bestial and barbarous disposition, and his might was feared. Like Pelagon thousands of years ago, Eris also had with him 200 scientists of high degrees, whom he made sub-leaders. In a blitz they fell upon Earth, raiding, murdering, and robbing the land. Mainly, they conquered the vast land in the Nordic regions, where the climate was temperate and very good. These were the regions which have been handed down to you as Hyperborea, and which were very far north before an earth upheaval shifted the Earth's axis, so that the regions which you call Florida are there today. There from the north Aru's son, Aru II, set out and invaded those lands which you now call India, Pakistan, and Persia, etc., going back to the earliest times, where they met the earliest ancestors of the Sumerians, who, being peace-loving, fled and settled far to the south. A people of dark complexion, but in your terms not Nigrid, but Europid and of great stature, sprung from a race of the former Syrian refugees, who also settled on earth 133,000 years ago in the like of the Pleiari refugees. According to the naming of Aris II, today's India was then called Aryan, which,
However,
after a few centuries, seceded from Hyperborea, after 210 years to be exact, and allied itself with the inhabitants of Mu and Agartha, while Aris the Fern from Hyperborea constantly harassed Mu and Greater Atlantis with evil acts of war in order to become their master. For about half a millennium, or more precisely for 502 years, these acts of war continued before Aris the Fur, who had become old and weak in the meantime, succeeded in infiltrating evil elements of his hate-mongers into the leading ruling classes of Atlantis and Mu, who, as well as their descendants, then secretly fomented violence and hatred for several centuries, until Mu and Atlantis could be completely destroyed by boundless intrigues a few centuries later, while only a few survivors were beaten into servitude. Great scientists, on the other hand, knowing of things to come and aware of their powerlessness, set out in spaceships and fled to former homeworlds in the Pleiades systems, where they were warmly welcomed.
Only small peoples remained on Earth, whose ancestors had long since mixed with early Earth humans who had emerged from Earth's development and created their own cultures.
I do not need to mention the destruction of Atlantis and Mu again, for you will find them as a separate record in the explanations given to you. So it only remains for me to report that Eris Tirkond, in his old days as a very distant descendant of Eris the Furfur, was assassinated by his third-born son, Jehavon, some millennia later and about a century millennium after the destruction of Mu and Atlantis, after which he took over the rule of the Hate people to rule them as well as 3 Earth folks and the Hyperboreans themselves. The one Earth folk were the very distant descendants of the Armis people who had lived where the lands of Armenia are today. These were the descendants of the Jishwish Armis, who settled there with their race 133,000 years ago, having emigrated from the Pleiara systems.
These descendants were already genetically aligned with Earth humans in such a way that their primordial origin was no longer ascertainable. Consequently, their original origin from the Pleiaren, planets 133,000 years ago, and their development in terms of hereditary traits and characteristics as well as dependent elements could no longer be proven.
With this, dear friend, everything should now really be clarified and nothing more should be questioned. If, however, such unpleasantness should occur again, then I will not go into it again, and by no means again. On the other hand, however, I will not hold back from correcting mistakes when they occur, as we have also done so far,